All right, everybody, welcome. We are so excited to have this conversation with you today. It is an important topic and one that has really captured the imagination and the concern of a lot of communities across Minnesota, and that is data centers. So my name is Aaron Clems. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer here at Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, and I'm excited to be the facilitator for this conversation. And this conversation is fueled by MCEA supporters. It's your support that allows us to work on these complex issues at the Minnesota legislature, in state agencies, and in the courts. Please consider a contribution to make even more of this work possible. And welcome to the latest on data centers, what's broken and how we can fix it. So MCEA has been advocating for a comprehensive regulatory framework to manage hyperscale data centers in Minnesota since proposals for these AI-driven facilities first started spreading across the state. We've now filed 5 lawsuits against cities and developers who took shortcuts in the environmental review process and approved studies that failed to meaningfully assess the potential impacts of data centers on our state's water, energy, and communities. We are part of an ecosystem of organizations, legislators, and residents who are pushing for greater transparency and regulation of data centers so that we can make informed decisions about their place in our state. This webinar, as we do for all of our webinars, will be recorded. It will be available to watch online on MCEA's YouTube page and on our website as well. So if you missed one or two things or want to share today's webinar with somebody else who couldn't make it, you can watch, share, and learn at your own pace. And here's what we have planned for today. First, we're going to break down the latest. That's part of the reason why you're here, I'm sure, on the data center landscape in Minnesota, as well as our primary concerns with how it's evolved to date and what it's missing. Secondly, we're going to provide an update on some of the lawsuits that we've filed, including why we filed them and where they're headed. Third, we're going to have a glimpse into one community, which is responding to a hyperscale data center proposal in their small town in southeastern Minnesota in Pine Island. We're going to talk a little bit about what's ahead as far as future proposals, as well as solutions to put Minnesota on better footing. And lastly, we're going to answer your questions, as many as we can. We'll hold 10 minutes for your questions at the end of this presentation. At the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A button at the bottom. That's where you submit your questions, and we'll get to as many as we can. The chat is disabled for attendees just to keep things less distracting for our panelists. Now, before we get started, I want to do a really quick Data Center 101 for people who are new to this potentially, so we can all have the same base level of understanding as we talk about this. Data centers are not new, but the emergence of what we call hyperscale data centers are just starting to be proposed in Minnesota. These are usually associated with AI efforts. But we also see proposals for cryptocurrency mining or cloud storage. Here in Minnesota, MCEA is tracking at least 17 proposals that have entered environmental review. The scale of these proposals is immense. Just one example, the tract proposal in Farmington. They proposed a 2.5 million square foot campus, about half the size of the Mall of America and larger than the Vikings Stadium. The Farmington proposal would consume 700 megawatts of electricity. That's more than the Monticello nuclear power plant produces every year. And it would need up to 600 megawatts of backup diesel generators, over 200 of them. It would consume over 900 million gallons of water every year for cooling. That's more than the current water consumption of the entire city of Farmington. And the noise and the light of this industrial facility would be just a couple of hundred feet from residential homes. And the metals consumed to refresh the computers every 2 to 3 years would quickly add up, increasing materials demands. And that's just one proposal, but a good example. And every one is a little different, but there are 16 similar proposals across Minnesota, which means that we simply don't have the power and water to spare for this unprecedented wave. And the early response of governments to these proposals has not met the moment. Secrecy, non-disclosure agreements, and vague project descriptions have concealed what's being proposed from their neighbors. So MCEA has stepped in. We've appealed 5 environmental studies for data center proposals in Lakeville, North Mankato, Faribault, Hermantown, and Pine Island. And that's where we're going to pick up the conversation with our panelists today. So as I mentioned, I'm Aaron Clems, I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at MCEA, and I'm honored to facilitate this conversation with 3 really great panelists. The first is Catherine Hoffman, our CEO and leader, and who leads our data center work. Thank you so much for being with us today, Catherine.
Thanks, Aaron. I'm excited for this conversation.
Yeah. Next, Luke Norquist. Luke Norquist is our John W. Pegg Legal Fellow and one of MCEA's attorneys involved in our data center lawsuits. Thanks for being with us today, Luke.
Happy to be here.
Great. And third, we have Aubrey Dirksen. Aubrey is a resident of Pine Island, Minnesota, who's helped form the community group concerned with the data center called Project Skyway in her neighborhood. Thanks for being with us today, Aubrey.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Great. Well, let's get started with you, Catherine. You've been directing MCEA's work on data centers and have quickly become a leading voice on transparency and environmental concerns surrounding them. Catherine, what's it been like to watch data centers so quickly take center stage in Minnesota? And how did MCEA get involved in this fight? Also, can you lay out the chief concerns MCEA has concerned and identified with data centers?
Sure. Yeah. So what's it been like? Alarming and a little surprising. So, we started hearing about some of these proposals probably 18 months ago now, and we're expecting the thing that I think Minnesotans have generally come to expect when there are big proposals, which is a process, right? There's maybe a public comment period, an opportunity to weigh in, to read some documents and really understand what's being proposed. And instead, we heard rumors, but we also heard crickets from state agencies and others. And what we learned is that these data centers are going through the process in a very secretive way. Um, and so we have that, that was about 18 months ago. And so since then, we've really been focusing on these projects for about the last year as the sort of preeminent environmental law organization. We do see it as our responsibility to protect our natural resources, to make sure that there is robust environmental studies and permitting processes for big projects like this that propose to come into the state. So I think there's probably a couple of major concerns that we have. The first one is that there really is no central permitting process. We think of other big projects, ones that MCEA has worked on in the past, power plants, pipelines, mines. All of these things have an agency whose job is to issue a permit and, at least in theory, say yes or no to that permit request. Now, we know that in some of those cases, agencies probably say yes a little more freely than we might like, but at least there is a decision point, right? And that's not really the case with data centers. There is no government entity that holds the whole, which kind of makes for a mess procedurally. We have maybe a local zoning commission or a local entity that makes decisions about zoning. There might be a little bit of a legal hook there. Maybe the Public Utilities Commission is looking at the diesel generators that are out back. Maybe the Pollution Control Agency is also looking at the air emissions from those diesel generators. Maybe the DNR is looking at water withdrawal permits. But nobody's sort of saying, yes, looking at the whole data center and saying, yes, is this, filled all the requirements? Is it done what we want it to do in terms of environmental safeguards and other things in the state? So it's just this kind of messy, problematic process that does not lend itself to good decision-making or transparency. And the potential impacts here are considerable. I mean, you mentioned a lot of them, Aaron, so I won't, go through those again, but we're looking at water, we're looking at electricity demand at a time where we have a goal to be carbon-free as a state by 2040. In many places, we've seen states build fossil fuel plants in order to service the electricity, and also who pays for that, right? It could drive up bills. The metals demand is always of concern for us in this state where we have potential mining operations. We're already hearing from them that they see AI data centers as a reason that we need to mine in Minnesota, as well as those local impacts. And then finally, and I think this is probably the most well-known thing, but it's really important to say it aloud, is that the data center developers are really, I would say, taking advantage of this lack of a permit process by keeping their projects secret or by keeping the impact secret. So we see proposals, we see a few different ways this is happening. The biggest one, of course, is these non-disclosure agreements that the developers sign with local government officials, and then they can't talk. They've agreed not to talk publicly, not to tell people that live in that community what's being proposed or what's being built. In other cases, we see that they are saying it's a data center, but the analysis or the details of the description are still quite vague, and it's very hard to assess what those impacts might be or what that means for our resources like water and electricity. And then in some cases, we actually see cities kind of courting data center developers. So they are sort of creating, building a blank space in their community, a parcel of land, and they are trying to set up a situation where a data center developer comes in, but they don't actually have one yet. They want to attract one. So we see those as well. So we're seeing these go through a variety of ways, but they're all kind of at the moment creating the same problem, which is a lack of information and transparency for the community about what's being proposed, as well as, of course, a lack of information in many cases for decision makers who are actually voting on these things. So those are the reasons that we've really gotten involved here.
That's really helpful, and thanks very much for that overview. And I want to pivot a little bit to some of the legal work that MCEA has been doing, and I want to talk to Luke for a second. So Luke is one of our legal fellows, one of our attorneys, and he's filed MCEA's first two data center lawsuits back in August versus Lakeville and North Mankato proposals. And he's a crucial member of our data center team. Luke, tell us a little bit more about what's been happening with MCEA's lawsuits.
Sure thing, Aaron. Thank you. So my goal is to do a 10-minute crash course across our 5 different data center lawsuits. So I hope people will bear with me as we zip across the map a little bit. But like you said, MCA has challenged the environmental review studies for 5 known or suspected data center proposals in North Mankato, Lakeville, Faribault, Hermantown, and Pine Island. In terms of the status of those lawsuits, the Hermantown and Pine Island lawsuits are in the earliest stages. Our North Mankato and Lakeville lawsuits have crossed through discovery and will enter the legal merit stage in early 2026. And our fastest moving lawsuit in Faribault, we just entered the legal argument stage and submitted our principal brief on the merits this Monday. So, to say a bit more about the merits of those legal claims, across the 5 lawsuits, you can bucket things into 2 main camps. First are concerns about secrecy and public transparency, and second are concerns about the quality of the environmental studies themselves. In terms of that first bucket, like Catherine said, the rollout of data centers in Minnesota, it's been marked by just this absence of information, even the basic information about what is being proposed. It was about 18 months ago that we started witnessing this surreal process, frankly, where massive projects were being announced, like million-plus square foot developments, sometimes the size of like multiple US bank stadiums smushed together. And they'd have these really funky names, like Project Skyway or Monticello Industrial. And when you looked at the studies for these proposals, the cities would often be saying, we are reviewing a project, and that project is a light industrial development. Which, that was it. That could be a million things, right? And if you're someone that has time and expertise, and maybe JD, and you dig into those studies, you see hints that they're data centers in things like the water appropriations numbers and things like the land use codes used for the traffic analyses. But it was all implicit. And so unfortunately, in Hermantown and Lakeville and North Mankato, a lot of our legal argument needs to focus on the basic fact that these studies don't say what they're studying. We're challenging them for a few reasons. First off, it is against the law in Minnesota. Thankfully, our Environmental Policy Act is pretty clear that if you anticipate building a large specific project, you need to be concrete about what that project is going to be. Second of all, the process behind that policy matters. We are a state where if you are a resident and some giant company comes to town and they have a plan to build some giant thing next door that's going to stick around for decades, state law guarantees you as that resident to have an opportunity to ask questions, to make comments, to raise concerns, and have environmental review be a process where those concerns are addressed and managed. And finally, we have concerns related to secrecy in terms of how it results or harms the quality of the environmental studies. Because as you might expect, if your study can't say what it is it's talking about, the study is going to be pretty ambiguous and bad. So to hop over into that second category of legal issues, I want to raise a couple examples about our concerns about the review of water impacts and the review of electricity and climate impacts. On water, we have a proposal in North Mankato, one of those mysterious light industrial developments, where the study that we're challenging said that the data center, or the mysterious light industrial development, could use up to 30 million gallons of water a day for cooling. Now that's like as much as like dozens of golf courses in one development. And concerningly, that water will be drawn from the Mount Simon Hinckley Aquifer, which is an aquifer that's a deep sandstone aquifer. It's an aquifer that recharges very slowly. And it's an aquifer that's actually protected under state law. To preserve this resource for future generations, the legislature has chosen to restrict withdrawals from the Mount Simon Hinckley Aquifer to only be allowed for potable drinking water purposes. Now, obviously, the data center doesn't qualify for that. So what did that mean for the study? Well, to start, what did not happen in the study was any review of the environmental impacts of 30 million gallons a day of water withdrawals. Nothing about what that would mean for the aquifer, nothing about what that would mean for nearby well interference, nothing about different ways and cooling technologies that could be used to mitigate the severity of that water withdrawal. Instead, what the city said is, we recognize that this withdrawal isn't allowed under state law, but they said it's okay because we're at the Capitol to lobby to remove those aquifer protections. Which, I think is pretty crazy. And the way I think about it is, environmental review, it's designed intentionally as a look before you leap process. You want to look at environmental impacts before you commit to massive developments. And in this case, what we saw is based off of the very limited review that occurred, there was this bright red blinking caution sign in the form of these aquifer protections. But instead of looking behind that sign to see what the concerns were and how to manage them, the city said, don't worry, we're going to take down the sign. So we're challenging that in court. And the second thing I wanted to call out were issues of electricity demand and climate impacts. These data centers, like you said, Aaron, they're like 100 to 600 megawatt facilities. That is as much on the upper end as the entire city of Minneapolis consumes, which just raises huge climate questions because when you add that much new electricity demand to the grid, a lot of the power is going to come from burning fossil fuels. Thankfully, environmental review is an opportunity where cities are instructed to calculate greenhouse gas emissions from electricity consumption and make commitments about what the developers are going to do to manage those impacts with things like sourcing from clean energy or carbon offsets or other ideas. But unfortunately, what we've seen in these studies is at least in Faribault and Hermantown and North Mankato and Lakeville, the same consultant has kept reporting shockingly low greenhouse gas emissions, like 1 to 2% of what we would expect based on the size of these developments. That raised questions for us. After a bit of digging, what we've discovered is that that consultant found a calculator where you can plug in the square footage of the development and get some generic estimate of electricity use, like assuming it's a Walmart or a warehouse. And they use that electricity number instead of the actual known and anticipated electricity demand of these massive data centers. This was most glaring in our Faribault lawsuit, where there was a draft study that actually used the right numbers, recorded the high electricity, the high climate impact, and got a lot of flack from residents saying this looks like a really big issue. What are you going to do to manage those impacts? In the final study, the city reported, we changed the calculations, the greenhouse gases practically disappeared, and that's because they were using the wrong numbers. So we're challenging that practice as well. And to wrap up, I'll just say the arguments we're making in these cases, they're pretty straightforward. We want the data centers to say what they are. We want the right numbers to be used. We want existing environmental protections to be respected. And it's a reminder to me that even if we have good environmental laws, which Minnesota in some cases does, they only matter if they are enforced. So I'm thankful that MCEA is an organization that can play a role in holding developers to the laws that we already have. And I'm thankful that we can move fast. So last thing I get to share today is in environmental review, once the studies are approved, then it's off to the races. And developers will, rush ahead to get their permits and start construction. And what we've seen in Pine Island in particular are really aggressive efforts to move full steam ahead with the data center proposal, despite the litigation, despite the shoddy studies. And so today, I get to share that MCA will be going to court on Friday and asking for an order to pause development on that data center, let the litigation play out, and then hopefully, send a message to these data centers that if they're going to come to Minnesota and impact our resources to build their computational power, that they're not going to get to cut through our environmental protections in the process. So I'm excited to see where that goes on Friday.
Well, thanks for sharing that exciting news, Luke. That's good. And it's also kind of telling that it's difficult, that you have to go to court to ask them to stop and actually follow the law. But that's where we're at right now. And I know before we came on, I was talking with you, Aubrey, about what you've been seeing in Pine Island. And just to reiterate, Aubrey is a resident currently fighting up the data center proposal called Project Skyway in Pine Island, Minnesota. She brings a really unique and important perspective, but also a really intensely local one. So, can you tell us a little bit what's being proposed in your community and how it's galvanized residents, Aubrey?
Yeah, so I'm from Pine Island, and Pine Island is a small rural farm town. We're about 20 minutes north of Rochester, and we have fewer than 4,000 people. So that's kind of the setup for where this is happening. We don't have any large industrial buildings. The biggest buildings in our town would be the grain elevator and the school. It's not like we are in a massive urban industrial area. And so Project Skyway is what the data center is known by, and it's by the developer's request considered a light industrial project that we had heard Luke talk about, and it is slotted for 482 acres of farmland, and the proposal is 3 million square feet of a data center build out, which is twice the size of US Bank Stadium. And I mean, that's a really big concern because, again, we are a small rural town that takes a lot of pride in being a small rural farm town and having a massive project twice the size of US Bank Stadium when your largest buildings are the schools and the grain elevator. That's huge. And that would permanently change the whole character of the town. And so residents have a lot of pride in being that small farm town and they don't want that to change. We live here specifically because we don't want to live in an urban area. I mean, Rochester and the Twins, Rochester's only 20 minutes away, and the cities are about an hour. So if we wanted to live in an urban setup, we have a choice to do that, and we are choosing not to. Some of the chief concerns that we have with that, so that's the description of the project. But as has been mentioned, the lack of transparency with this project as it's been ongoing has been a flashpoint in our community. And there's been a lack of public process. There hasn't really been any genuine two-way conversation at any point in this project. So the city did an AUAR and they tried to say, well, we don't know what we're building. We don't know if the building's going to be a data center. So we can't be specific with project details or with what we're evaluating because that would be overly prescriptive, are the words that the developer has even used. But I did a data request and it shows that the city has been in talks with Ryan Companies, the developer, since at least January 2024, where they were specifically discussing a data center proposal that would use 10 million gallons of water a day. So while they tried to claim that they didn't know what they were building, they've clearly been planning a data center for 2 years. But as residents, we've only just learned about this in the last 3 months. And within that 3 month window, it went from being brand new information to development applications, permitting, and zoning approvals that were unanimously approved last night by the Zoning and Planning Commission. So, and when we're trying to bring this to the attention and say we have been left out of the conversation, this project requires public process. Our city officials tell us that we are jumping the gun, fear mongering, and spreading misinformation. At the open forum in October, our mayor threatened us with criminal charges without any evidence. And then our city council members openly mock people on the town's Facebook page by putting laughing emojis on any comments that are critical of data centers. Another one of the issues with the transparency piece are the non-disclosure agreements, which have been mentioned. And if you've been following the data center stories, you've probably heard a lot of bits and pieces about this. So two of our city administrators and our city engineers signed non-disclosure agreements, which prevents critical information from the project getting out. The city council members have not signed NDAs, but when we met with one to like talk about the project and ask him questions, raise our concerns, he's like, well, you know what? You can meet with me, but I'm just going to go get the information from the city administrator, who is only getting information from the developer. And then with this AUAR with the project, they didn't provide a single estimate of the total energy use for the project. This is all blind. There is no total megawatt usage provided. And Excel reps told us last week that they do, in fact, know how much energy that they're going to use, but they're not going to disclose it because it's trade secret. So even if our city council members have not signed non-disclosure agreements themselves, our city they're only getting information from our city leaders who have signed non-disclosure agreements, and they're only getting information from the developer who is not disclosing the information and has no interest to actually do that. And our city leaders, what we're seeing is that they are not seeking out other sources to adequately address any concerns that are brought up so they can make truly informed decisions. And then they blame their residents when we're upset, going, hey, slow down and pause. Give us a seat at the table and do your due diligence because we care about this town and we expected you to do the same. And you're showing us that you're not.
How did the Stop the Pine Island data center group get off the ground? And how many people were involved? And what are you doing right now to push back?
So we started just 5 moms. Most of us are in the healthcare world. 3 of us are neighbors. And so they're basically one mom started talking to another one because they worked together and said, hey, did you hear about this? Did you notice anything about a data center? And then it became, well, no, I didn't. So then spreading the word on our streets. So that, those 5 of us moms, like we're clearly very educated. We're informed about health concerns. We know where to be looking and paying attention and what to be reading. And so we started that initial effort of getting that word out in our town. We were speaking at the city council meeting. In September, we found out a few days before the September 16th city council meeting where they finalized that AUAR draft. And so our small group has grown a little bit. Our core group is about 10 to 12 of us. Our Facebook group is called Stop the Pine Island Data Center. And so we've got over 400 people on it now. We do have a change petition that has over 750 signatures on it. We've done yard signs, we've done banners, we have done stickers that you can put on your car or your water bottle or your laptop to try to get the word out. We've been writing letters to the editors, op-eds, speaking at city council meetings, holding community meetings. We're educating ourselves. We're spreading all of the educational materials that we can when we come across a podcast or the webinar. We're talking with our neighbors and yeah, I mean, we've been hitting the ground running and having to learn on the fly.
And that's a lot of work to do. And especially when this is work that your government should be doing for you in a lot of ways. But of course, when they're not listening, it falls on citizens to take action. And I'm wondering if you have advice for other folks who might be concerned about data centers or concerned about a specific data center in their community.
Yeah. First, contact your state legislators and demand that comprehensive regulations around data centers get passed, and that needs to happen now. Session is starting up again in February. Data centers are expected to be a primary issue that they're focusing on. Personally, I want to see a statewide moratorium and an immediate halt to all projects until these comprehensive plans and regulations are in place, because this is not something that we should be figuring out as we go. The risks and the permanent damage that can happen, they're way too high for not getting the right guardrails in place beforehand that look before you leap. And we have plenty of information and examples to look at to inform us at how to better design those regulations, but we need that state level advocacy. We also need you getting involved at your local level of government now. If you think that your town isn't like contemplating a data center proposal, you're probably wrong. They just haven't told you yet. Check your comprehensive plan at your town for zoning changes, the wording of warehouses, from looking at how are they planning out residential versus agriculture versus industrial usage of the land, and have your conversations at that local level now about getting temporary moratoriums in place so that your local leaders have time to utilize new resources that are getting developed that would help them make informed decisions about if a data center were to come to town, what would that look like? How can we not do what the towns that are being sued are doing? Like, we need to do better. So have those conversations with your local level government about banning NDAs, getting local ordinances in place for specific data center zoning, for example, light pollution if you don't have it, get community benefit agreements established that highlight what are you as residents consider to be benefits for your town? What are your non-negotiables for any development, but especially for data centers? What are you not willing to jeopardize, even when everything else might seem good? Community members need to be involved in that process. And in my town, we have been excluded from it. And developers end up getting prioritized over the voices of the residents. So get involved now. Good Jobs First also has excellent guides with questions to ask. When a data center comes to town locally, what should you be asking about? And also for state level policy recommendations as well. And then the Coalition for Responsible Data Center Development also has like a Data Center 101 toolkit. There's a lot of people that are paying attention to new resources are coming out. And then lastly, you can follow pages of the communities like mine. Again, we are the Stop the Pine Island Data Center. These other cities that were mentioned, Hermantown, Lakeville, they also have residents that are mobilizing against the data centers, not because we are anti-technology, but because this has to be done responsibly, because we as the residents, we're paying the price when local leaders do not do their due diligence. There is a human cost that needs to be factored in because we mattered and we are not dispensable. So back us up, contribute to our GoFundMes, follow our pages, sign our petitions, spread the word, do your own due diligence, and educate yourself. And then again, recognize that even if your town doesn't have a data center proposal currently in the works, you are still impacted because our water sources are connected. What your neighboring town does will affect what happens in yours, because these decisions, like massive projects like data centers, they don't stop at town lines. So you do need to care and you need to speak up.
Thank you so much, Aubrey. That was a really good rundown, not only what's happening in Pine Island, but kind of how communities can get organized and respond to these proposals. And again, I think you should follow Aubrey's advice. This is amazing advice, quite honestly. And you're seeing communities across the nation start to get organized in similar ways because they don't feel like their government are responding appropriately to the proposals that are in front of them. But I also think the first point you made is really important. And I want to turn back to Catherine on this one, which is about Minnesota and how we can adopt a more comprehensive and helpful statewide process for putting some good guardrails on what's being proposed here. Minnesota is going to head into its legislative session in February. So what opportunities do we have there to strengthen the protections for our natural resources and communities from the potential impacts of data centers?
So I want to start. We do have some, there was some progress made last legislative session, and I think it's important to recognize that. And we have legislators who are championing these causes. So for example, we do have some language that was passed that strengthens our 2040 carbon-free standard. I saw someone ask in the Q&A about like, well, we're going to meet that, and so it's in law, so what's the problem? And there are off ramps in our 2040 law. And so for example, if it becomes too expensive in terms of electricity rates, or there are logistical challenges of meeting those standards, our Public Utilities Commission can grant exceptions and say, you know what, utility, you're not going to be able to meet this, and so we're going to give you till 2045 or 2050 or something like that. We need to have laws that strengthen these, because that 2040 requirement is not, it's not a magic wand, right? But we did make some progress there. We also had a provision that provides for a voluntary process for data centers to work with the DNR about their groundwater withdrawal. But there's no specific requirements that these data centers do anything better in terms of electricity use specifically, or in terms of water use. And so we're really missing that. So we need to do better. We also haven't addressed non-disclosure agreements. We haven't addressed environmental review. We haven't addressed a permitting process. As well, there are these proposals for a moratorium that Aubrey mentioned that will likely come up. I'd be interested if those bills move forward. I'd be interested in something that also requires some study in the meantime during the moratorium, for example, of the sort of cumulative effects of all of these data centers on our electricity rates and infrastructure, on our water use, and things like that. And I'll just mention a couple like specific things that would be helpful. In terms of environmental review, a mandatory EIS or environmental impact statement for all of these data centers. Right now, they're going through this localized process that Luke and Aubrey mentioned, the alternative urban area review, which in fairness, doesn't have to be terrible. Like it is possible to make a good and robust AUAR. They just haven't done that. And in general, AUARs are more geared for local projects to look at local impacts like stormwater management on the site or traffic flow, for example, if you're building like an office park, things like that. They're not really geared for these bigger projects. An environmental impact statement is a tried and true environmental review tool that state agencies know how to use and can be robust and effective. It has at least 2 public comment periods associated with it, so lots of opportunity for public engagement. So we'd like to see that required for these data centers. I'd like to see that permitting process through a central state agency, which we definitely don't have right now. And as far as the non-disclosure agreements, what I would like to see is limitations on the use of those. So a non-disclosure agreement, they can make sense like early in a development process when a developer is sort of contemplating doing something and they might want to know a little bit more about how a parcel of land is connected now to the sewer system or the water system. And maybe they haven't bought it yet and they want to avoid people knowing they're interested because that might cause some competitive bidding, et cetera. Like very early on, it can kind of make sense. But there's 2 situations where a non-disclosure agreement should never be used, and I believe we should limit this in state law. One is elected officials should never sign non-disclosure agreements. We should never have a circumstance where a company can secretly lobby an elected official and the public doesn't know about it. That's not acceptable for democracy. In the second case, any of those non-disclosure agreements should end and be rendered null and void, essentially, at the point where environmental review starts. So at the point where we're actually doing a study that is supposed to inform the public about the project, we should no longer have any agreements in effect for anybody that limit what we're sharing. Because this is what we're seeing. We're seeing these government officials in this sort of untenable position of they've agreed not to talk about the project or the specifics of it, but they're also trying to present a study to the public of what the project might be. Like it's no wonder these studies are so bad. We just shouldn't have this circumstance ever come up. So we have some great legislators who are wanting to partner with us on this. Obviously, the legislature, quite divided. Whether progress is possible or not, I don't know. But I will say there's a ton of energy on this issue, and even in some cases, some bipartisan energy. And so I'm hopeful that it will be at least possible to make some progress.
Well, that's really great. Thank you for the rundown on that. Obviously, we're headed to, I think, late February. February 17th is the beginning of the Minnesota legislative session. If you want to weigh in with your legislators, particularly on the NDA issue, the non-disclosure agreement issue, there's a link in the chat that allows you to email your legislators directly and ask them to take action in the ways that Catherine just described. So if you were persuaded by that, I hope you'll join us and ask your legislators to take that particular action. Now, the good news is we've got about 20 minutes left for questions. The bad news is we've got 80 questions. So we've got so many things that we want to get to, and it will be very, very difficult. So we'll do our best. And I think there's some really interesting and thoughtful questions in here. So thank you so much. And if you have additional questions, I'll do my best to get to them. Please put them in the Q&A. I see folks raising their hands, but we're not going to use that technique. Please put your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom. I want to turn to one that was put in anonymously because I think it's a really smart and thoughtful question. And it asks, with the current state mandate of 100% carbon-free energy by 2040 and new data center legislation 2025, and the fact that Minnesota is a regulated electric utility state, what's the concern about electric rates and greenhouse gases when both things are already mandated or state law? Do you not believe the state and MPUC or the Public Utilities Commission are capable of upholding rules, regulations, and laws? I think it's an interesting question, and I'm wondering. We'll start with you, Catherine. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it is an interesting question. The first thing that's important to know is that the Public Utilities Commission has jurisdiction over supply side on electricity, but not on demand side. So our Public Utilities Commission is not authorized to, and none of our utilities are authorized either to say no to a project. So if somebody builds a data center, no matter how big, and wants to plug in, they're essentially entitled to do that, and the utility has to service it. And so, as a state, we're making good progress towards our 2040 carbon-free energy goal, but electricity demand has really been quite flat across the United States and in Minnesota for the past 20 to 25 years. And now we're looking at these projections of massive increases in electricity use. That's not only data centers. We are, for example, electrifying things in businesses and homes and even our vehicles. So there are some other factors there, but data centers are for sure a very big one. And so there's a question of just a logistical and a cost question of, can we build clean energy? Can we continue this transition to clean energy fast enough, given this massive projected increase from data centers? And I don't think we know the answer to that at the moment. I think there's a couple things we can do about that. One of them is we can look at strategies to ensure that the data centers are carrying the cost for the clean energy carrying the cost of a clean energy build out to service their needs. This is sometimes referred to as the Beyonce model, bring your own clean energy. Sorry, it's a terrible acronym, but it's very memorable. And the idea is that the data center would then pay for the, whatever clean energy resources it needs, in addition to infrastructure, because there's often transmission lines and other things that come in order to service that demand. So that's one strategy. Another strategy would be a sort of comprehensive study that utilities could do in order to try to manage and project this. We do some of this in Minnesota already, but we want to make sure we take the data centers into account. So there's a variety of things that we can do, but the Beyonce strategy is not required under Minnesota law. All that's required under Minnesota law at the moment, honestly, is that they get to plug in. And so we can't just assume that 2040 is not self-implementing. It's going to require a lot of hard work to get there, and data centers will make it harder. And so we need to make sure we have strategies in place to make sure it doesn't derail that effort.
That's really well put. And I will just add one more thing to that, which is we're already seeing other states regulators struggling with this. Not because they don't have laws or they don't have standards, but because the scale of the problem is so great that we're seeing grid operators and utility regulators in other states basically saying we got to put the brakes on this. And so this is not a criticism of Minnesota's Public Utilities Commission. It's really about the scale of the problem.
No,
Aubrey, I'd like to turn to you. There's a good question by Arlene in the chat. She wanted to know what state legislators in your area are hearing about the Pine Island project and what their response has been.
Sorry, I didn't catch the first part. That was for me.
Yeah, it was for you. So Arlene in the chat asks what the response from state legislators in your area has been to the Pine Island proposal, and if you've heard anything from them.
We have not heard as much feedback from them. I know one of our representatives is definitely supportive on banning non-disclosure agreements, and they are backing that. I know that they have confirmed that they have concerns about the projects and they are paying attention, but they have not taken a direct stance yet. So there is still continued work that we're going to, with the legislative session starting up, there's going to be a lot more contact once that's actually in session. And it will matter a lot more once we have actual bills. Right now, there's a lot of push and requests saying, hey, this is what we're seeing and this is what we would like you to get behind. But until session is actually active and there's real bills, right now it's just the advocacy part on our end.
Thank you. And then one other question related to the specifics of the Pine Island proposal. You mentioned earlier that the Planning and Zoning Commission in Pine Island met last night. Allison asks if they've approved special use permits from planning and zoning.
I'm not aware of the special. I would have to look. Again, as a resident, we're doing all of our learning and getting caught up to speed really quickly. So last night it was to approve the preliminary plats for the development application, and then the PUD, preliminary use description. Correct me on all of the acronyms. Again, I don't remember them all offhand, which were unanimously approved to recommend to the city council next week to approve.
Yeah, and if I understand the process correctly, and I serve on a planning commission in my city, the Planning and Zoning Commission makes recommendations, the city council has to make the final approval. And so by doing that, now it's been heading to the city council for a final approval. If that's the same process they follow in my city. I want to turn quickly to Luke. There's some questions about the legal process in here, and there's one in particular that's a little bit wonky when it comes to legal stuff, but for folks who follow legal cases, they might understand this, but the question is about standing. Has anyone challenged MCEA's standing to bring the lawsuits that we brought?
Not yet, thankfully. For a primer, a standing is a requirement under Minnesota law where if you're going to go to court as a party, you have to have some stake in the matter that you are challenging. And so I think for us, the case law is pretty clear that if you are an environmental organization like MCEA, it is part of your mission to uphold and defend Minnesota's bedrock environmental laws. And so I think we have pretty good standing based off how prior courts have looked at the issue to defend a standing challenge if it were raised. We also have members in these communities who could be impacted by like the local impacts or the water impacts or things like that. So we haven't faced the challenge yet, and I think if we did, we would be equipped to manage it.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
This question is going to go back to Catherine because I think it's more general, and it's a good question from Colleen in the chat, which is, are data centers being targeted to Minnesota more than other states due to our natural water resources and aquifers?
Yes, they are. So generally, the national trend is there were a couple places where the initial build out started. I mean, the United States already has way more data centers than any other country in the world, including China. So we have, we're quite equipped with many of these facilities. And the build out started primarily in Northern Virginia, and there's also a pretty big concentration in Texas. And those areas are at this point pretty well saturated. Like it's hard to get more onto the grid. The water resources are strained. And so the developers are looking elsewhere. And Minnesota is on the short list. Like we are definitely a place where these developers want to go. And they tell us that they're interested for a few reasons. One is that we have the cooler climate, which may lower their cooling costs. Another is more abundant water resources. And the third one is that 2040 carbon-free energy law. Often these companies have some sustainability goals and they're looking for a location that may have clean energy that's consistent with their sustainability goals. And so, yes, for sure, we're seeing this demand happen here. I think one of the things I met with many of these developers and had conversations with them. And I think a couple things about this. One is that their notion of abundant water resources may not match with ours. I mean, historically here in Minnesota, we have talked about historically, I think we've treated our water resources as being kind of infinite, right? We think of ourselves as a water abundant state. And we are, of course, compared to like Arizona, right? But that doesn't mean that they are actually infinite. There are, restraints, and aquifers can be depleted. I mean, Luke mentioned, the one that already has some protections on it because it's under stress. And so it's one thing for them to say, oh, we got all the water we need in Minnesota. I think it's another for us as people to live here to say, you can have unrestrained access to our water, right? I don't think it justifies that, and that doesn't actually make sense for us as a state. The other thing is that I do think there's some tension in these developers' notion that they're coming here because of our 2040 carbon-free energy law, but then also they do we do hear sort of grumblings about complying with the regulatory structures that we have, right? They come here because they like this law, but they don't really like complying with our laws. For example, we did see Amazon, end their investment, or say they were pulling out of a data center investment in Becker because there was Public Utilities Commission jurisdiction over the 250 diesel generators they were putting out back. And obviously 250 diesel generators, which by the way is a number that could happen at any and all of these sites because these backup generators are very common, is relevant to whether we make our 2040 goal. They are backup generators. So they don't run all the time, but also we've seen circumstances where actually they do, even though they're supposed to be backups. This happened in Memphis at one of Elon Musk's company's data centers. They run it all the time because I think it's actually cheaper for them at this point than buying off the grid. I'm not sure why they do it. But in any event, the Public Utilities Commission is exerting authority, and Amazon pulled the rug out from under the project, which doesn't feel very consistent with saying we want to come here because of your 2040 carbon-free law. And so, for sure, the investment and for sure the interest is there. And because of some of our sort of natural advantages and infrastructure advantages, but that also means it's really important that we have the laws in place to actually protect those advantages that we have.
That's really well put. And I would just add one thing I saw on the news last week, which is that Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, leader Chris Wright said that they might consider just having all those backup generators run all the time, so we wouldn't have to build new backup, new power plants. And so, what's currently being portrayed as something that runs very infrequently could become something that's run constantly, similar to what you were saying about Memphis. Thanks. That was a really good example. I have a question for Luke, and this is a question I saw in a number of places, but Jean Miriam asks, how does a non-disclosure agreement defeat the basic tenets of the Minnesota Data Practices Act, and does it need some amendment to clarify things? And I'm wondering if you know a little bit more about that, Luke.
Yeah, we researched this, and I would say, in spirit, there's a definite tension there, right? If NDAs were used as a reason to not disclose public records that people have a right to access, that would be a problem. Fortunately, there are advisory opinions issued that have already clarified that cities cannot use non-disclosure agreements as a reason to refuse issuance of public records that people request. So on the technical side, that conflict has already been resolved, and the public records trump NDAs. But we worry that that might not always be clear to cities across Minnesota who feel like they've signed this really restrictive agreement with developers. And so I think having some process, like we talked about our allies at the Capitol who are interested in addressing the NDA issue, we think having some additional clarity on that matter is really important going forward.
Yeah, and it's also really hard to know what you don't know, right? So, for example, if somebody who's responding to a data practices request for a city who is under a non-disclosure agreement feels a conflict between what's being asked of them under the Data Practices Act and the non-disclosure agreement, it puts them in a weird position, and they might not give a complete answer. It's not saying that there's any problem with that person, but whenever there's confusion between or tension between the role that you're playing as a public official and an agreement that you've signed, it creates all sorts of unintended consequences.
Yeah, and we do find, Aaron, that the cities are less experienced in responding to these Data Practices Act requests, I think, on the whole, than the state agencies. State agencies tend to have a process. They get these all the time. Cities struggle a little bit more. And I do think it increases the odds of that, them maybe not fully complying, maybe not even intentionally, but out of confusion. I think you could definitely get into those issues.
Yeah. I'm going to send our last question to Aubrey because I think this question made me think, and it was, what do you wish your local officials would do with the proposal that's in front of you? How would you want them to treat you and the community that where the proposal is being made?
Great question. And I actually sent a very clearly worded email to our city council and the Planning Zoning Commission. It's also on our Facebook page if you want to see. But One, we have been, as residents, we've been asking for a pause. But what I would like to see is one regarding non-disclosures. The mayor of Superior, Wisconsin, actually set a really good example recently about non-disclosure and saying that it violates community trust. And while there might be specific situations where it could apply, those situations are few and far between. And community trust is far more important. So he has banned city staff from signing them. So first off, I requested of my city council and the mayor, I said, look at this ordinance, look at how they are treating non-disclosure agreements. So this is how you should have responded in the first place. You can still change course and respond this way in the future. So I would like you to ban those non-disclosure agreements or come up with a similar statement as Superior's mayor did to just acknowledge like public trust is important and you serve us as your constituents, not a developer. We want to stop to the project right now. At this point, a city can say no. Yes, a clock started with a 60-day, with the submission of the development application and the permits. There's a 60-day clock that gets started where the city has to take a decision to approve or deny. A city can deny it. You can say no. So we want our city right now to say no. And there were even specific ordinances from our town's code that were brought in front of the zoning commission last night saying you have a town ordinance to not cause harm and that if this would impact the quality of life of your residents, like you have to follow that. So you can go back to your town ordinance and say, this isn't in line with what we want for our community, and there's a lot of concerns, and we want to listen to this. We might be open to a data center in the future, but right now it's too much. So we're going to withdraw from the project and say, no, this doesn't meet our community needs. And then get intentional conversation, two-way conversation. None of this one way where only people can talk, but there's no reciprocal communication. Two-way, genuine, authentic, intentional communication with your residents to go over what are our hopes for our town. What would we like to see for growth and economic development? Modify the comprehensive plan for your residents, not for a developer. Enact a temporary moratorium on new data centers so that you can explore all of these. Have the meaningful conversations with your residents, get a solid plan in place, check your ordinances, come up with new ones, like the data center zoning ordinance specifically for your community. Check that. Work with your residents to come up with that so that things don't have to be adversarial. When you can actually have that two-way conversation with everybody at the table, you avoid getting sued. That is a wise decision to pause, do your due diligence, use the resources that are coming out so you can make wise, informed decisions. That way, if a data center proposal comes in the future, you have already covered all of the critical information. And you know that if you pursue this, it is in line with what your residents want. You're not going to be getting the level of resistance that you are seeing now. You're not going to be sued by the developer or other agencies that are concerned because you have done your due diligence to address the concerns in a thorough way.
That's really well put. And I'm glad we ended on that note because I think it's so important to have this kind of two-way communication between folks who are affected by proposals and the governments that are overseeing that proposal, and then the folks that are putting the proposal together. And so far, right now, it feels like a game in some ways where people are trying to short circuit the process, trying to find the easiest path through it, and then portraying anybody who says, wait a second, this is not the way we're supposed to do it as being the problem. And I think that's just the opposite of what's actually happening here. So first of all, I want to thank all of you for your amazing insight here. And thank you so much, Aubrey, Catherine, and Luke, for your different perspectives on this issue. It's been super helpful to hear it. And I hope that you got as much out of this conversation as I did. This, by the way, has been a record for MCEA. I think at one point we had over 400 people online at the same time. This issue is such a huge issue for our state. And we are so grateful to everyone who gives us support to allow us to talk about this issue and to take action on it. There's a whole bunch of resources that have been put in the chat. We hope that you'll take action to tell your legislators to address NDAs. We hope you'll also consider supporting MCEA's work. Part of the reason why we're able to do this work on data centers is because over half of our donations come from individuals like you. And that gives us the flexibility to nimbly respond. So when, 18 months ago, we weren't thinking about this as being an issue that was a significant one for the state. Now it clearly is. And your support makes it possible for us to take those actions. So thank you for that support. And please go on our website, mncenter.org, and click donate. And also you can learn more about our data center work there. That's under issues at the top of the website. Again, I want to thank Aubrey, I want to thank Catherine, and I want to thank Luke for this wonderful conversation. This will be posted, as all of our live webinars are, on our YouTube page and also on our website. So if you miss anything, you want to share it with somebody else, that's going to be available to you, and we'll follow up with that information too. And also, apologies to everybody that put questions in the chat. There were so many good ones, we couldn't get to them in time, even with having 20 minutes devoted to questions at the end. So thank you for your interest, and thank you for taking action on this issue. Thanks again. This has been AI Data Centers, what's happening and what we can do about it. My name's Aaron Clems. This is MCEA, and thank you so much for sharing your lunch hour with us. We'll be in touch with you soon, and we'll have another webinar soon for you as well. Thanks so much again. Have a great day. Bye-bye.